Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate the great intro into what is critical infrastructure. So I'll be speaking specifically about Ukrainian critical infrastructure, but the health sector. So on both sides of the front line, um, which we know can be very different. So the current state of war in Ukraine. So I just want a couple things to keep in mind. So at the current rate of advance for Russia, it would take 83 years for them to conquer the rest of Ukraine. And I bring that up simply to say that the status quo is slowly changing, but nothing's happening quickly. So when we talk about healthcare and the critical infrastructure in healthcare in Ukraine, we're talking about something that we're looking at the long game, right? We're not just looking at something that is changing very quickly on the ground. And this is obviously projecting a bit, but it seems like the most likely end state to this war is some kind of settled negotiated settlement where part of what Ukraine has lost to Russia will likely remain with Russia, and then the other parts will be Ukrainian. So that is again to say simply that the idea of critical infrastructure. We have to take a long view of this whole subject. So what does that mean for critical infrastructure in the health infrastructure in Ukraine? It means that we have to see how to rebuild it. Is really what it comes down to. So when I say critical infrastructure, critical health infrastructure in Ukraine, I mean, and just not just Ukraine and other places as well. I mean, obviously hospitals and medical clinics. Those are the things that people think of first. But you take the broad view of this. So that includes, for me, health infrastructure includes some of the things that Dennis was speaking about, which is power generation, transmission lines that feed into the hospitals and clinics. You can't run a hospital or clinic without power. Also, water supplies, you need clean water for the health infrastructure. And then I would take it even a step further and say workforce, so doctors, nurses, support staff to keep the thing running. Infrastructure, a lot of people think of physical assets, but to me, it's also the personnel that have to maintain those assets and keep things going. So any reconstruction efforts in Ukraine, when we think ahead to this main end state, it must rebuild health infrastructure in Ukraine. Otherwise, similar to what Dennis was saying, if people are cold because they don't have heating in their houses, it's similar to if they don't have health infrastructure to go to, they're not going to want to return. They'll leave, which has all kinds of pressures on the EU, all kinds of pressures within Ukraine itself, and all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So to look at the current kind of snapshot of health infrastructure in Ukraine, it's suffered immensely over the course of the war. So the Ukrainian Healthcare Center has been tracking, and the WHO to a lesser extent, but the UHC has been tracking specifically attacks on hospitals, clinics. So since February 2022, there's been recorded 2,000 attacks on health infrastructure. Some of those are damaged, some of those are completely destroyed, and you can see from the red dots here on the map, it really is all over the country, but it's mainly concentrated along the front line. So on the right there, there's ample evidence that Russia is similar to the power infrastructure, is targeting specifically health infrastructure in Ukraine to make things harder for the Ukrainians, to divert assets away from military activities for the Ukrainians, to say, oh, we have to rebuild these hospitals and things. So it's a deliberate tactic. There is, however, some good news in spite of all this. In Ukrainian held territory, almost 1,000 healthcare facilities have been either repaired or reconstructed. Some of that is with EU money. The EU has and some other development institutions have put money towards this to help rebuild. But a lot of it is really actually coming from Ukrainian sources, the government, which obviously they don't have a lot of resources right now, but they do see this as a priority to rebuild some of their health infrastructure. So it's a remarkable feat that anything's been able to be reconstructed with, the threat of missiles coming and the war continuing. So that was in the stats that I just gave, are mainly with the Ukrainian parts that are still under Ukrainian control. So along the front line, the situation is quite different because the front line, and it's the nature of this war is attritional in nature, in the sense that it's long, as I mentioned before, long, slow, grinding assaults, and oftentimes the cities that are being assaulted are completely flattened. You think of Bakhmut, which was basically completely flattened to the ground. It's just a city in eastern Ukraine, and that's means that the health infrastructure on the front line is likely destroyed as well, right? So along the, and also what happens a lot of times right along any health infrastructure that is on the Ukrainian side of the front line is repurposed to serve the soldiers or the supporting of the actual fighting that's going on, which in turn can make those hospitals or clinics military targets. Lose the term loosely, but so that just means that health infrastructure along the front line is, for the most part, decimated. And if you go back to this slide here, you can see again the front line. Yeah, where you can see what most of the attacks are on the right there, right along the front line on health infrastructure. So now an interesting point, in which you actually don't hear a lot about, is health infrastructure in Russian occupied territories. So Russia is taking this land and basically saying, no, this is now Russia. So you would think that they would want to rebuild things and make it so that, look, pride and joy, look, now it's Russian, there's a nice hospital. So this is an example of a hospital that was built in Crimea. Now, you have to remember, Crimea has been under Russian control for a lot longer than some of the other provinces, but this is just to say that there have been some efforts on the Russian occupied side to rebuild some of the health infrastructure. Again, a lot of the times, because of the way that the war is being fought, they're starting from nothing, having to rebuild almost entire hospitals. So, but Russia's having difficulties in accomplishing a lot of this. Some of it, I think, is maybe a lack of will. That's not their priority to rebuild the health infrastructure. They're not caring so much about the, peace and security of the people of the land that they've just conquered. But other things are actually very, very specific and material reasons why it's been difficult to reconstruct. So first of all, most construction workers are male, and most males are somehow involved now in fighting, to the point where there's a shortage of labor, to the point where Russia has brought in North Korean laborers to help build things, maintain things where the Russian men are fighting. So that obviously would make it harder to build hospitals, health clinics, and other things if you don't have a lot of people to actually build them. The other part is, which is rampant in a lot of the now Russian-occupied areas, is just corruption schemes. So money is earmarked for a hospital, a health clinic, and then somehow the money disappears and it's gone somewhere else, who knows where. So that's another thing that is keeping any reconstruction of the health infrastructure in that area down. And the third thing is simply, which is Ukraine is having the same issue, obviously, is just money is going elsewhere. Money that could be go to rebuild hospital, health clinic is going to soldiers, tanks, drones, whatever else is needed for the actual war effort. Now to speak about reconstruction, so I've talked about all the destruction mostly, but now reconstruction, again, I look at this in something reconstruction can happen some now, but it also is looking at the long game of what will happen in the future once some kind of a negotiated settlement is reached and people are more confident in being able to reconstruct something that's not going to get hit by a missile the next day. So Ukraine and the EU will by and large pay for the reconstruction of its health infrastructure. I think, as Dennis was mentioning, the EU is making efforts to integrate Ukraine into the EU, which means that the largest donor to Ukrainian reconstruction will likely be the EU. And Ukraine will have to fund some of this themselves too, through loans or other means. U.S. support at the moment under the current administration is uncertain, but I could see, we've seen the Trump administration has changed its positions on a lot of things. It could possibly be one day down the road, whenever things settle down, that U.S. funding is more forthcoming. You never know. And just some past examples of recent examples large-scale reconstruction. So one, I was just speaking with Sam about it. The Marshall Plan was large-scale U.S. reconstruction of a lot of things, including health infrastructure in Europe. But more recent examples are in the Balkans. The EU paid for a lot of reconstruction of health infrastructure in the Balkans, mostly EU money, and then also in Iraq, which was the United States was the occupying force, and then rebuilt some of these institutions and critical infrastructure, and then left. So these costs, the estimates, I've seen estimates widely range on what the reconstruction cost of all of Ukraine would be, but then specifically health infrastructure, I've seen it range from tens of billions to hundreds of billions. My guess is it's more like hundreds of billions, especially as things continue, hundreds of billions of euros. So given the current state of the conflict, in my opinion, large-scale reconstruction cannot currently occur. I think even with the Ukrainian example, the government has rebuilt, but mostly repaired a lot of hospitals. And I think rebuilding at a large extent and rebuilding all the infrastructure that connects hospitals and connects them to power and everything, investors are unlikely to do this as the threat of war and missiles and drones is looming. So yeah, in my opinion, that will really begin in earnest the reconstruction of healthcare infrastructure once the war settles down, or at least has reached some kind of settlement. So now we'll pass it to Sam. Thank you.
Yeah, I just to make this transition, I think it's really important to look at several aspects that you mentioned. The one regarding the attrition, the fact that it's a war of attrition by Russia against Ukraine will require a lot of resources, and it will have to involve countries from the region. It's not only the EU, but also Turkey, which probably will play a very big role in the reconstruction of Ukraine, and then everything that goes through Turkey in terms of critical infrastructure, be it energy or transport, is exactly which will be very, very helpful. And then the second point that you also hinted at is about the front line and when this front line will actually stabilize, because it's not only about the drones or missiles or cruise missile that can reach a certain target on the territory controlled by Ukraine, but it's also about the small assault. At the moment they change the tactics, so it's about 2 people on motorbikes that are entering, and then it's very fluid, the front line. So until it's not really settled, it's very hard to understand where exactly you can invest, as you explained. So I think that these are very important variables for our conversation about the reconstruction of Ukraine.
Right, no, and I think you made a good point. I was looking through the lens of the EU, but I think if you look in the other direction to the east of Ukraine, some of the connectivity of these projects is very important. So you mentioned Turkey, but also Azerbaijan and Armenia, the recent deals where it looks like some critical infrastructure will pass through those countries. That has a lot of bearing on what happens in Ukraine, and I think the Black Sea area in general. And I think Sam will speak some more to that.
So, will you change the slide?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks. So yeah, first of all, thanks to EUI